almost 24 now. That milestone birthday is quickly approaching. It feels like it should hold some significance, like I should have things figured out by now. But instead, everything has only grown more complicated, especially after last night. My stepfather Mark and his best friend David did something I still can't quite wrap my head around. It wasn't what you'd expect, and that's the real problem. It wasn't an act of force. It was messy, confusing, and now I'm left trying to make sense of it all. Mark became part of my life when I was 12. Mom met him at a work conference. He was charming, the kind of man who could talk his way out of anything, always armed with a joke or a story. He made Mom laugh in a way I hadn't seen since my dad left. It wasn't a fairy tale transition. There were adjustments. He wasn't my father, and I made sure he knew that, especially in my early teenage years. But he tried. He really did. He came to my school plays, even when they dragged on forever. He attempted to teach me how to fix my car, even though I was hopeless with anything mechanical. He was present in his own way. David, on the other hand, was always just there, like a shadow. He and Mark were inseparable, friends since college, I think. David was quiet, reserved. He'd smile, but it rarely reached his eyes. Always watching, always absorbing. He was the kind of person you'd forget was even in the room until he spoke, saying something that made you stop and think. They were a package deal. If Mark was around, David was too. Dinners, barbecues, even just watching TV. Eventually, it became normal. Mom loved it. She loved having them around, like she had. 2 extra protectors, 2 extra sources of laughter. She had always seemed lonely after Dad left, and Mark and David filled that void. They made her feel safe. Last night was supposed to be a casual gathering, just the 4 of us. Mom made her famous lasagna, the one with extra cheese that always upset my stomach but was too good to resist. There was wine, of course, Mark's favorite red. He always said it helped him unwind. Everything felt normal. Too normal, maybe. We laughed, caught up, talked about random things. Mark told a story about his latest work trip, exaggerating as always, making us laugh. David was quiet as usual, but occasionally threw in a dry remark. That cracked us up. I was exhausted, stressed. I'd been working extra hours at the coffee shop, trying to save up for a new laptop, and sleep had been impossible. Those nights when your mind just won't shut off. The wine hit harder than usual. I felt light, giddy, like the world was tilting just a little too fast. But it wasn't unpleasant. It was freeing. For once, I could just let go. Mom was radiant, as she always was when Mark and David were around. It was like they were her own personal sunshine. She never took my worries seriously. She'd dismiss them, tell me I'd be fine, or that I was overreacting. Never cruel, just absent. If I had nightmares, she'd tell me to go back to sleep. If something upset me at school, she'd say not to dwell on it. She kept things light, happy, carefree, and I adapted. She wasn't a bad mom, she worked hard, provided for me, but emotionally, she was distant. A wall stood between us, one I could never break through. Mark and David fit right into that world. Last night, I crossed a line I didn't even realize was there, and now I don't know if I jumped, was pushed, or simply walked into it. The lasagna was gone, plates cleared, the second wine bottle half empty. Mark had moved to the couch, sprawling like he owned the place. David sat in the armchair, watching him with quiet intensity. Mom hummed as she cleared the table, unaware of the subtle shift in the air. I was weightless. The wine had fully settled in. I remember laughing, too much, at things that weren't even funny. My inhibitions melted like ice cream on a hot summer day. I was relaxed. Too relaxed. Mark started another story, this time about a late-night poker game on his work trip. He always had these stories, exaggerated, captivating, expertly told, and I was completely drawn in. Mark had a way of making you feel like you were right there with him, completely drawn into the moment. David would occasionally interject, his dry, sarcastic remarks cutting through Mark's exaggerations. That was their dynamic, the push and pull, light and shadow, 2 sides of the same coin, inseparable. My gaze drifted to David. He was watching. Mark, but there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't exactly lust, but it was intense, like he was seeing something no one else could. The conversation shifted as conversations tend to do, especially with wine. We talked about work, movies, the upcoming holidays. Mark, as always, was the center of attention, holding court, ensuring everyone was entertained. Mom sat back, content, a soft smile lighting up her face. I, on the other hand, felt restless, like I needed to move. I got up under the pretense of getting more wine, but really, I just needed a moment away from the couch. The kitchen was cool and quiet, a welcome break from the warmth and noise of the living room. I stood at the counter, staring out the window, watching the shadows dance in the moonlight. A strange sense of detachment washed over me, as if I were observing myself from a distance. The wine was making me feel disconnected. When I returned to the living room, something had shifted again. Mark was leaning forward, his voice lower, conspiratorial. He was telling a story about a time he and David got into trouble in college, some reckless joyride involving a stolen car. I sat on the arm of the couch, close to Mark. He smelled of wine and aftershave, a familiar, almost comforting scent. David, still in his armchair, was watching me now, his gaze fixed, intense. Mark's story grew wilder, and I found myself laughing along, caught up in his energy, his charisma. I leaned in, drawn by the moment. Then the conversation changed. Mark started talking about fantasies, about things he had always wanted to try. He was vague, suggestive, but the implication was clear. He was talking about sex. I felt a jolt, shock, excitement, fear. I wasn't sure, but I didn't pull away. I leaned in closer, intrigued. David was still watching me, his silence louder than words, almost like a challenge. Mark's hand brushed my leg, and I didn't flinch. A strange sense of power coursed through me, as if I was the one in control, the one calling the shots. The next moments blurred together, a haze of sensations, fragmented images. I remember Mark's hand on my skin, the warmth of his touch. I remember David's eyes locked onto mine, unreadable yet unwavering. I remember the taste of wine, the scent of their cologne. I felt reckless, like I was shattering every rule, throwing caution to the wind. I remember pulling off my shirt, the look on their faces, surprise mixed with desire. I remember the heat between us, the weight of their stares. And then, the video. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. It felt like I was outside my own body, watching someone else. I remember the phone, the flash of light, the sound of the recording starting. Then it happened. A series of moments, touches, whispers. I felt confused, disoriented, like I was trapped in a dream, unreal and inescapable. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and an overwhelming sense of dread. I found the video on my phone, a short, grainy clip of everything that had happened. I watched it over and over, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't rape, not in the traditional sense. I was there, I was participating, even initiating. But it didn't feel right. It felt wrong. Watching the video was like watching a stranger, someone else making choices I couldn't recognize. I felt disgusted, ashamed, confused. How could I have done that? How could I have let it happen? The video was proof. Proof that I wasn't a victim in the way I wanted to believe. Proof that I was complicit. And that was the worst part. Knowing I had played a role, that I wasn't just a passive observer but an active participant. I kept rewatching it, searching for an explanation, a justification, but there was none. Just me, them, and the lingering sense of something irreversibly wrong. Mom, she's always been complicated. Our relationship is like a tangled thread, knotted and twisted, impossible to unravel. I spent my whole life seeking her approval, her understanding, but there was always a distance, a gap I could never close. Growing up, she was the strong one, the one who held everything together after Dad left. He was a ghost, a faded photograph, in an old album. She rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was with a tight-lipped silence that made me afraid to ask more. Determined to build a new life, my mother worked tirelessly, sometimes holding down 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. She prided herself on being fiercely independent, a woman who didn't need anyone, or at least that's what she wanted the world to believe. She projected strength, the kind that left no space for vulnerability. I remember yearning for her, comfort when I was scared, hoping she would hold me, soothe me when I was sad. But instead, she would simply pat my shoulder and tell me to be strong, to toughen up. She wasn't intentionally cold, I know that, but she was distant, emotionally unavailable. Then Mark came into our lives. He was like a breath of fresh air, a burst of warmth after a long, cold winter. He made her laugh, brought her back to life, filled the emptiness inside her. And I was happy for her. I really was. But at the same time, I felt pushed aside, like I was no longer the center of her world. She changed, becoming lighter, happier, more carefree. She would spend hours on the phone with Mark, completely absorbed in their conversations, laughing and talking as if nothing else mattered. When I tried to tell her about my day, my friends, my worries, she would nod absent-mindedly, smiling, but her mind was already elsewhere. It wasn't that she didn't care exactly. It was more like she didn't have the emotional space for me anymore. She was so focused on her own happiness, on her new life, that she had nothing left to give. And now, when I needed her the most, when I needed her to understand, to believe me, to help me make sense of what had happened, I was met with silence. I waited until we were alone in the kitchen, the same kitchen where we had shared so many meals, so many quiet moments. With shaking hands and a pounding heart, I showed her the video. She watched, her face blank. No shock, no anger, no horror, just nothing. It was as if she were watching a commercial, something insignificant. When the video ended, she handed my phone back to me, her expression unreadable. "Boys will be boys," she said flatly, her tone dismissive. "They were just having a little fun." I stared at her, my mouth dry, my mind reeling. "Fun?" I whispered. "Mom, this isn't fun. This is wrong." She shrugged. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," she said. "You weren't hurt, were you? You looked like you were having a good time." I struggled to find words, my voice unsteady. "But I don't understand," I stammered. It felt wrong. It felt like they took advantage of me. She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're a grown woman. You knew what you were doing." Then, with a knowing smirk, she added, "Besides, you were the one who started it, weren't you?" A wave of nausea rolled over me. "What?" I gasped. "No, I didn't." "The video doesn't lie," she said, her voice sharp. "You were the one who took off your shirt. You were the one teasing them." My stomach churned. "But I was drunk," I protested. "I didn't know what I was doing." "That's no excuse," she said, her voice cold. "You're responsible for your own actions." Then she gave me a pointed look. "Besides, I've seen the way you look at them, especially David." Her words hit me like a slap. "Mom," I said, my voice rising, my chest tightening. "That's not true." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? Then why do you keep watching the video?" I froze. She knew. She had seen me replay it. She continued, her voice laced with something cruel. "Maybe deep down this is what you wanted. A little fantasy come to life. You're a young woman. They're men. It happens." "Mom, please," I begged, tears spilling down my face. "You're not listening to me." "Oh, I'm listening just fine," she said, her tone sharp. "And I'm telling you, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. You could have done much worse. At least it was them, people we know, not some stranger." "That doesn't make it." "Okay," I screamed, my voice cracking. "They were supposed to be my family." She sighed, long and exasperated, as if I were exhausting her. "Look," she said, her voice softening just a little. "I know you're upset, but you need to let this go. It's not worth ruining our lives over." "Our lives?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What about my life?" She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone, broken. I felt betrayed, abandoned. She didn't believe me. She didn't trust me. She was choosing them over me. And maybe, deep down, she always had. Looking back, I realized this wasn't the first time she had dismissed my feelings. It was a pattern, a recurring theme in our relationship. She had always prioritized her own happiness, her own comfort over mine. She had always been willing to look the other way, to pretend everything was fine, as long as it didn't disrupt the perfect little world she had built with Mark. She had found her happiness, and I, her own daughter, was a threat to that. That night, I didn't just lose my innocence. I lost my mother, too. The silence after she left was deafening. It rang in my ears, a reminder of just how alone I was. I retreated to my room, the one place that had once felt safe, but now felt like a prison. My phone, the device that held the damning video, sat on my nightstand like a ticking time bomb. I reached for it, my hands trembling, and hesitated, like I was holding something dangerous, something venomous. Then, with a deep breath, I pressed play. Grainy images flickered to life on the screen, and there I was, a stranger in my own skin, laughing, touching, wanting. The image didn't match the feeling inside me. There was a disconnect so profound it made my head spin. Why did I do that? The question echoed relentlessly in my mind. Was it the wine? Was it them? Or was it me? I replayed the video, frame by frame, analyzing every movement, every glance, searching for something, anything, that would prove I wasn't a willing participant. But all I saw was myself, engaging, flirting, leading. The self-loathing settled deep in my chest, an ache that wouldn't fade. I felt dirty, used, even though I knew logically I hadn't been physically forced. The violation wasn't external. It was internal. A breach of trust. A shattering of the person I thought I was. My already fragile self-esteem crumbled. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the girl staring back at me. She was reckless, careless, someone who had made an irreversible mistake. Who am I? I asked my reflection, but the silence was deafening. I felt like I was unraveling, my identity slipping through my fingers. The psychological weight of it all seeped into every aspect of my life. Sleep became impossible, haunted by flashes of the video. Food turned to ash in my mouth. My mind, once a place of constant thoughts and daydreams, was now trapped in a single endless loop, replaying that night over and over. I started to withdraw, isolating myself from my friends, my coworkers, my entire life. I was afraid of their judgment, afraid of their whispers, their laughter behind my back. I could already imagine them watching the video, seeing what I had done, what I had become. They would never understand. My past relationships had always been a struggle, but now they felt like proof of something deeper, something wrong within me. I had always struggled with trust, built walls around myself to avoid getting hurt. Now those walls were crumbling, revealing a broken, fragile person underneath. There was Michael in high school, my first real relationship, my first real heartbreak. He had cheated, and I never truly recovered. It left me believing that every man was capable of betrayal. After that came a string of meaningless encounters, each one leaving me emptier than before. I had been searching for something, for someone, but I never found it. And now I questioned everything. If I could make such a devastating mistake with Mark and David, what other mistakes had I made? What else was I capable of? I became hyper-aware of my own body, my own desires. Every glance, every touch, every stray thought felt like something dangerous, something to be examined, dissected, policed. I was afraid of myself, afraid of repeating the same mistake. The isolation was suffocating. I felt like I was trapped in a glass box, watching the world move around me, unable to reach out, unable to connect. Even work, once a distraction, felt foreign. The coffee shop, the customers, the laughter of my coworkers, it all felt fake, like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. I went through the motions, pretending to be normal while inside I was crumbling. Sometimes I would catch myself staring blankly, lost in the maze of my own thoughts. Was it my fault? Did I want this? Am I broken? The questions spun endlessly, a relentless storm in my mind. The nightmares started soon after. Vivid, disturbing dreams where I was trapped, surrounded by faceless figures whispering, their voices echoing in the darkness. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my body trembling, my heart racing. I began to question my own reality. The lines between what was real and what was imagined blurred. I felt like I was floating, lost in a sea of confusion. I started avoiding Mark and David entirely. Even when Mom insisted on family dinners, I made excuses. I couldn't bear to sit at the table with them, to hear their voices, to pretend nothing had happened. Their presence was a wound that refused to heal, a constant reminder of that night. I was living a double life, pretending I was fine while inside I was drowning in guilt, shame, and uncertainty. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Was this what a breakdown felt like? Was I going crazy? The thought was terrifying, but also strangely comforting. Maybe if I was losing my mind, I wouldn't have to deal with this. Maybe if I was crazy, I could escape from reality. And then there was the video, that cursed video. It became an obsession. I watched it at all hours, morning, night, whenever. I was alone. I paused it, rewound it, slowed it down, desperately searching for something, some hidden truth, some explanation. But all I found was myself. A version of me I didn't recognize. A version of me I hated. The more I watched, the more I felt like a stranger in my own life. I was disconnected from everything, watching, but never truly present. I felt like I was fading, like I was disappearing. Trapped in a cycle of self-destruction, I replayed that night in my head, analyzed my every move, questioned my own sanity. I was lost in a dark tunnel with no end in sight. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of it all only grew heavier.